Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about the feeling I get when I read a classic that was written in the past and is set in the past, and this a feeling of escapism, of experiencing a world that is not mine, and just how much I love that feeling. I actually got the idea for this video not from reading a classic, but from reading a piece of historical fiction, and I'm currently reading The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, which is not a classic. This is written in the 20th century, but set in the 12th century. And I'm reading this as part of a read-along that I'm hosting with Andrea from Infinite Text. So if you're interested in that, there's still time to join. We're not far into the book yet. You can still catch up. I'll put a link to the announcement videos in the description box. But anyway, so this is a piece of historical fiction, and I'm getting the same sense from historical fiction to a degree, where I just love the idea of exploring a completely new world, but a world that's not made up like a fantasy world or a science fiction world, but a world that actually existed, that real people experienced on this very planet that we're on, but in a different time. And I like thinking about how different that world was, about how different the technology was, how people interacted with each other, even down to things like the languages they spoke or the way that they addressed each other. All of that stuff I absolutely love. However, what takes me out of that with historical fiction to some degree is that authors of historical fiction always tend to over-explain the historical background of their books. And this is not a criticism, this completely makes sense because, well, first of all, if you are an author and you've written a piece of historical fiction, you want to show off all of the research that you've done, but also you want to make sure that the reader feels as comfortable in this strange world as the characters in the book. And therefore, authors of historical fiction tend to explain in great detail, for example, how the technology works, how transportation works, even down to things like what people eat or explanations of the societal structures. Whereas with classics that are written in the same time that they're set, talking 100, 200, 300 years ago, they don't feel the need to explain these things because the authors assume that the readers share the same cultural knowledge of their own time. So for example, if you had a book that's written in 2019, published in 2019 and set in 2019, you wouldn't find explanations of, for example, what a train is, or how social media works, or what a smartphone is, because the author and the readers already have that knowledge of their own contemporary time period. And that is what I love about reading classics. So for example, when Jane Austen talks about travelling from one place to another per post, or when the characters talk about buying a new bonnet or buying a new dress, or when the female characters in Austen's books are limited in what they can say to male characters, and all of the politics around introducing one another and socializing. All of these things play a really big part in Jane Austen's books, but they don't have to be explained because the reader already should know what they're all about. The reader should already have the societal context. Now that makes it slightly difficult for 21st century readers trying to get into classics because, of course, we don't have that shared cultural knowledge. So we have to do a little bit of research and actually figure out how long it takes to travel 20 miles in 1813. Or we have to figure out why Mr. Bennet is not the most polite and courteous man in Pride and Prejudice. All of these things are not explained because the author assumes we already know them. So like I said, that does put a barrier between classics and modern readers. And I, as a historian, find it really interesting to research those things. So I'll happily Google population of England in 1795, if that's what I'm interested in, or what was the postal system like in 1776. So all of these things are kind of expected of us to research in order to understand these books. Although again, that's not 100% true, because you can totally read Pride and Prejudice and not know anything about the technology of the 1800s and still enjoy the story. But I do think you get more out of the story if you know the background. But back to my main point, every time I read a classic, and to a lesser degree every time I read a work of historical fiction, I just love the feeling of immersing myself in the past, of experiencing a time that I will never experience. And I want to make it very clear that this is not me wishing to live in the 19th century or the 1950s or the 1730s or whatever period I'm reading about. I'm very, very happy that I live in the 21st century, where I have rights that Jane Austen didn't have, where I don't have to struggle with the same things that Charlotte Bronte had to struggle with, or in fact her heroines. I'm really glad that I don't live in 1135, where this book is set, where, let's be honest, I wouldn't survive a week in those times. So I'm very happy that I live with the privileges that I have got, that generations before we didn't have, but that doesn't take away from the joy of trying to imagine what the world was like hundreds of years ago. And that, in a nutshell, is why I love classics. I wonder if you feel the same thing. Do you feel the same sense of escapism? Do you find it really, really interesting to read about the world as it was in the past? Or do you prefer to read about your own issues, your own world, your own contemporary context? Or do you prefer to read about completely different worlds, maybe worlds that take analogies from our current or past societal structures, but that are completely made up, as in fantasy and science fiction? Please let me know in the comments. Yeah, there isn't much a point to this video. This was just a feeling that I wanted to express that I got while reading The Pillars of the Earth, but that I realised really applied much more to classics. By the way, Jane Austen July is coming up, so if you want to experience some of that escapism yourself, if you want to see what life was like 200 years ago, then pick up a Jane Austen book next month and see for yourself. Thank you for watching. Bye.